Legalized sadists, Dvorkin's totalitarian sect. Every totalitarian sect seeks power over the world and over everyone. That's what makes it a sect. A.L. Dvorkin. Today, the world faces unprecedented challenges that concern not only global change, but also threats to democratic principles posed by authoritarianism and totalitarianism. New hidden forms of instability and chaos are at play worldwide. Today, we will discuss their creators and ideological implementers. For those who have studied the rise of the totalitarian Nazi regime in Germany, led by the psychopathic figure of Hitler, it becomes clear that totalitarianism did not vanish entirely with the defeat of Nazism. Today, it exists in a hidden form. It mimics, merely altering its shape and outward appearance. A serious warning of its concealed existence is the growth of authoritarian movements and the activation of covert negative forces that, among other tactics, employ media violence, sow enmity and hatred among people, and incite wars and conflicts. The mimicry of totalitarianism. Let us recall that totalitarianism is a form of power that seeks complete control over society, the actual elimination of rights and freedoms, and the repression of opposition and dissenters to retain power. An inevitable companion of the emergence and development of totalitarianism is sadism. The manifestation of covert sadism can often be observed through aggression, which has recently been abundant in informational content that employs methods of manipulating consciousness and subconsciousness, as well as media violence. This contributes to the artificial creation of conditions for the psychological destabilization of people by instilling fear and aggression in them. This social tension, maintained and stimulated by the media, is used by certain groups as a means of covert control and suppression of the masses. In turn, this leads to the social and psychological degradation of society. But what is the goal of those who are interested in provoking such shifts in mass consciousness that cause deformation? The fact is that such a manipulated mass consciousness is typically characterized by a lack of critical perception of reality, submission to the strong, conformity, a tendency towards stereotypes, intolerance of different views, suppression of dissent, aggression, and militarism. In other words, all the hallmarks of Nazism. One of the most striking examples of totalitarianism mimicking modern conditions and covertly spreading Nazi ideas of superiority is the international totalitarian sect of Alexander Dvorkin. It is indeed a totalitarian sect, a destructive cult, because the rigid totalitarian-style organization with an international network of agents of influence that Dvorkin has been building for 30 years meets all the criteria of a totalitarian sect. Specifically, the presence of a charismatic leader or guru, a hierarchical pyramid structure of power, intolerance of any criticism, the use of manipulative methods and mind control techniques, and involvement in secret orders and collective rituals. Dvorkin's totalitarian sect is a hybrid of the Inquisition, political orthodoxy, communism with Soviet-style repressions, and totalitarian Nazi ideology. Let us recall history. The term political religions was first introduced by German political scientist and historian Erich Vogelin in his early work Political Religions, 1938, where he described as political religions those totalitarian ideologies, such as communism, fascism, and National Socialism, that claim absolute truth, replace traditional religious values, and use violence to achieve their goals. Dvorkin's totalitarian chimera functions as a repressive form of political orthodoxy, acting as an intermediary that binds religion to political action and the state to religious inquisition. It is a kind of perverse imitation of the throne and altar alliance, driven by the obsessive idea that politics must depend on religion, and religion must actively participate in politics and define it. It is evident that Dvorkin, having once immersed himself in Byzantine ecclesiastical theory, which asserts that Orthodox Christians can have only one sovereign, secretly dreams of becoming this Byzantine Basileus himself, and is enacting this vision through his highly dangerous totalitarian sect. Dangerous because Dvorkin, much like apologist Walter Künnet during the Nazi era, employs the same methods, strategies, and tools, only on a larger, more global scale. He skillfully manipulates public consciousness, turning the state's repressive machinery against society, which consists of representatives of more than 160 ethnic groups and 70 religious movements. All of Dvorkin's totalitarian sect's practical activities, as of political religion with a totalitarian ideology that transforms orthodoxy into a titular religion, are in fact aimed at executing his project, creating political conditions for destabilizing not only society but also orthodoxy itself, seizing personal power and eliminating competitors. This is evident, among other things, from the reigning circle of Dvorkin's close associates, which, apparently, was formed according to special manic psychological traits inherent in their leader or based on willingness to sacrifice themselves for his dictatorial ambitions. Notably, as he moved into a phase of violence, his first attack was directed at his own fellow believers. Dvorkin's power is based on indirect control, emotional pressure, and persuasion. By parasitizing on the intersection of religion and politics, Dvorkin cloaks his pragmatic and self-serving interests in religious rhetoric while actively striving for personal control over all aspects of human life. This is evidenced by his activities, the growing omnipotence of his totalitarian sect, the widespread acceptance of Dvorkin's totalitarian ideas among the general public, and their influence on the political elite, and not only in Russia. The latter often remain unaware of the true origins of these ideas, making Dvorkin's control over their thinking even stronger. Dvorkin's propaganda is so effective that those who fall under its influence think in preconditioned stereotypes, judge the world based on his disinformation, emotions, and false images. Yet, they sincerely believe they are acting independently at their own free will. As the saying goes, the best slave is the one who believes he is free. Using Künnet's methods and anti-cult rhetoric, Dvorkin fills people's minds with doubt and negative imagery, ultimately paralyzing their ability to act and plunging them into a state of emptiness and loss of meaning. And then he offers them his own, Dvorkin's system of sadistocracy, which would give a person a sense of purpose and the opportunity to feel connected to power. For a sadist, exploitation is a form of passion, born from an insatiable need for vengeful triumph. The greatest reward for a sadist in exploiting others is the sensation of power over them. Above all, a sadist seeks to show people that they will never be worthy of him. His relationships with others are built entirely on his own projections. He perceives people and their actions as reflections of himself, projecting onto them his own flaws. In this sense, much of what Dvorkin says about totalitarian sects is in fact true, because he is describing himself, his organization, and the structure, tactics, and methods of his own totalitarian sect. Dvorkin's international totalitarian sect exhibits all the characteristics of extremism and terrorism, including planning and organizing violent acts aimed at intimidating the population and achieving political, ideological, economic, or religious goals. In contemporary realities, the signs of extremism and terrorism manifest both in specific informational terrorist acts and in the organization or sponsorship of physical terrorist acts, such as mass shootings, school shootings, or assassination attempts on politicians. These acts are aimed at terrorizing the population or social groups to directly or indirectly influence decision-making in the interests of the paymaster or the leader of the criminal group. Dvorkin's international totalitarian sect operates covertly, positioning itself as an independent shadow force under the guise of an anti-cult movement, not only in Russia but also in democratic countries, right under the noses of various intelligence agencies. The coordinating center of Dvorkin's sect is RACIRS, Russian Association of Centers for the Study of Religions and Sects. RACIRS also has regional subsidiary centers. Dvorkin is not only the president of RACIRS, but also the president, founder, and ideologist of its inner core, the Information Consulting Center for Religious Studies in the name of Hieromartyr Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, nonprofit organization, Center for Religious Studies, CRI. Moreover, he is the vice president of the French FECRIS, European Federation of Centers of Research and Information on Sectarianism. Dvorkin serves as the coordinating link for anti-cult activities across the post-Soviet countries and some Western democratic nations, including the United States. He directly or indirectly interferes in religious and political matters, exerting a covert destabilizing influence from the position of an unnoticed shadow force. Formation of RACIRS subsidiary organizations. Why is a shadow force dangerous? What is the danger of a shadow force with a clear totalitarian bias and usurpation of power by one person? The covert destabilizing influence of an independently operating shadow force leads to the following consequences. Destabilization within any country as a result of the accumulation of critical mass of artificially induced social tension, including through the actions of media controlled by the shadow force. The pushy media coverage of problems, which is not aimed at resolving them, but rather at amplifying negativity and contradictions, creating societal imbalance through media violence and manipulative psychological tactics. This induces fear, aggression, anxiety, a sense of hopelessness, and a lack of security among the population. The covert orchestration of a coup, a violent seizure of power, or a hidden takeover through active influence over the legislative, judicial, and executive branches. History teaches that when the executive leadership usurps power, it gains control over all key state institutions, including the legislative and judicial branches. In essence, the division of power into separate branches was designed to prevent power usurpation and to avoid strategic mismanagement of society by protecting it from dictatorial maniacs and individuals with inadequate behavior. Destabilization at the international level. A drive toward global chaos, radical fragmentation of the international relations system, and the creation and escalation of crises and conflict zones. This includes social and political upheavals, dangerous clashes and confrontations, and the creation of a tense environment, teetering on the brink of global war with the threat of tactical and strategic nuclear weapons being deployed. As history has shown, such interference by an independently acting shadow force, secretly led by a person with manic tendencies, eliminates any possibility of accurately forecasting future prospects, risks, or positive turning points during critical and dynamic periods of societal change. The influence of such an uncontrolled force becomes especially dangerous in times of instability and abrupt climate change on the planet. Dvorkin's covert sadism. How did Dvorkin, using the anti-cult movement as a cover, manage to weave a web of his own power, so as to ensure that his covert command gives rise to organized harassment of tens of thousands of people and organizations in Russia, the United States, European and Asian countries, discredits the current authorities, law enforcement agencies, and threatens the lives of famous people, politicians, and businessmen? How did it happen that a man with a mental disorder record who is known in narrow circles is able to send down behavioral narratives and instructions to destabilize a certain state, and lobbies for amendments to changes in laws that are beneficial for the expansion of his power? Why are the law enforcement and judicial authorities still ideologically misled, dangerously misinformed, and are forced to turn on the repression machine serving the interests of Dvorkin's totalitarian sect? Who allowed his agents of influence to turn young people into kamikaze-like biorobots, remotely controlled to carry out school shootings, mass shootings, political assassinations, and incite ethnic and religious hatred? All of this invisible Nazi-like dictatorship began with the creation and imposition of a single core stereotype on society: that all religious movements, regardless of their nature, are cults and dangerous. He ensured that the words sect and cult not only carried a negative, repulsive connotation, but became a stigma of social exile. For over 30 years, he has used this label to stigmatize any social group that does not serve his interests, portraying them as antisocial in the eyes of the public. One might think, what does religion have to do with embedding totalitarian ideologies into people's minds? This imposed stereotype continues to drive societies apart, fostering fear in some and illusions of superiority in others, thus solidifying Nazism in people's consciousness. In our articles, we already mentioned that Alexander Dvorkin, is a direct successor of the Nazi Protestant anti-Semitic pastor Walter Künnet, adopting his ideological methods of dehumanization and discreditation in the fight against undesirable groups. To briefly recap, in 1921, Walter Künnet founded and led the Apologetic Center in Nazi Germany. Like his follower Dvorkin, Künnet initially focused on collecting information about so-called sects and cults, or, more precisely, organizations that were inconvenient for the Nazi regime. Künnet's Apologetic Center had close ties to the Nazi Ministry of Propaganda. He compiled blacklists and handed them over to the Gestapo for further persecution and execution of ordinary civilians, fueling the state's repressive machine. History still remembers how many people were murdered or sent to concentration camps when the Nazis unleashed this machine to its full capacity. Künnet's systematic activities became one of the key factors that led the world to the Holocaust and, subsequently, to World War II. The same thing is happening now in Russia, except Dvorkin's blacklists are much longer than Künnet's. As the saying goes, the student has not only surpassed his ideological mentor in tyranny, but has taken it even further. Today, due to Dvorkin's covert tyranny, numerous individuals and organizations are arbitrarily and baselessly labeled as dangerous cults, destructive sects, spy organizations, and totalitarian sects, leading to persecution, repression, and arrests. Where did Dvorkin's covert sadism and hatred for people come from? It is well known that behavioral patterns, knowledge, and attitudes toward others are integrated into a person's worldview during their development and formation. Sadism is a tendency toward violence, a craving to derive pleasure from humiliating and tormenting others, and a drive for absolute power. As a rule, sadistic tendencies begin to manifest in early childhood through a proclivity for violence and abnormal behavior. Often, such a person incites aggression in others, provokes conflicts, bullies peers, engages in fights, mistreats animals, and so on. So where did Dvorkin's covert sadism originate? One can only speculate, considering the facts of his biography, his difficult childhood in the USSR, the early breakdown of his family, or his mental health during adolescence. In other words, the combination of factors that shape sadistic tendencies, a sense of emotional abandonment, alienation, exposure to cruelty from others, insults, punishments, and abuse. These experiences cultivate resentment, vindictiveness, a need to inflict suffering on others, emotional instability, and a drive for dominance and total control. These are the very factors that imprint a future sadist with thought patterns like, "People are unworthy of my respect and love. The people around me are a source of danger. To survive, I must make others fear me, and violence is the only way to exist." A sadist is devoid of any kind of empathy. He is convinced that every person harbors purely hostile intentions, and therefore, those around him deserve only contempt and punishment. The essence of a sadist is a conscious and subconscious readiness for destruction, along with a compulsive pathological obsession with power. In his youth, during the 1970s, Alexander Dvorkin was under observation for 4 years at a neuropsychiatric dispensary in Moscow. He was diagnosed with the following mental disorders: cyclothymia, pathological personality development, and psychophysical infantilism. It should be noted that cyclothymia is a mild form of bipolar affective disorder, BAD, historically known as manic depressive psychosis. In medical practice, such conditions are known to render a person unfit for any kind of academic, public, or political activity due to extreme subjectivity and perception, an inability to adequately assess the consequences of their actions, and an incapacity to take responsibility for them. Sectologist Alexander Dvorkin turns out to be a trivial madman. May 14, 2014. A. Dvorkin, a well-known specialist on cults and the founder of sectology, was under observation for 4 years at neuropsychiatric dispensary number 3. According to his published medical records, Dvorkin was under care at a psychiatric dispensary for an extended period. His initial visits to a psychiatrist were related to various anxieties, apathy, and feelings of hatred toward his relatives, following conflicts with whom he attempted suicide. The patient hears the same melody in his head, feels that someone is standing behind him. He was transferred from neuropsychiatric dispensary number 3 to psychiatric hospital number 14, where he underwent a month-long examination and inpatient treatment. He was diagnosed with the following mental disorders: cyclothymia, manic depressive psychosis, pathological personality development, and psychophysical infantilism. According to both Russian and international psychiatric practice, a full recovery with these diagnoses is impossible. Only temporary remission is achievable. For those with manic depressive spectrum disorders, continuous psychiatric supervision is required, with mandatory weekly visits and sustained treatment with prescribed psychotropic medications under a physician's care. Such conditions are known to render a person unfit for any kind of academic, public, or political activity due to extreme subjectivity and perception, an inability to adequately assess the consequences of their actions, and an incapacity to take responsibility for them. Dvorkin had to be discharged from psychiatric supervision without an approval by a psychiatrist as a result of his emigration to the United States. He began his work criticizing religious movements in 1992, immediately after returning from a 17-year stay in the U.S. Within a year, he had opened the country's first anti-cult center. By 2006, similar centers had appeared in other Russian cities. Members of the association have frequently been accused of inciting interreligious hostility. Like attracts like. American psychoanalyst and psychologist Karen Horney, in her book, Our Inner Conflicts, A Constructive Theory of Neurosis, explores the causes, development, and treatment of neurotic conflicts. She provides the following description of the psychology of a covert sadist. He is hypersensitive to humiliation and suffers excruciatingly under it. But in addition, because he chafes under his own weakness, he is often actually attracted to openly sadistic persons, at once admiring and abhorring them, just as the latter, sensing in him a willing victim, are attracted to him. Thus he puts himself in the way of exploitation, frustration, and humiliation. Far from enjoying such maltreatment, however, he suffers under it. What it gives him is an opportunity to live out his own sadistic impulses through someone else, without having to face his own sadism. He can feel innocent and morally indignant while hoping at the same time that someday he will get the better of the sadistic partner and triumph over him. So, what shaped Dvorkin's neurotic inclinations, his ultimate transformation in worldview, development of covert sadism, and the formation of a social circle filled with people who exhibit sadistic tendencies in his international totalitarian cult? One key factor is strikingly evident. Dvorkin's time in the United States as a young man coincided with the active growth of the American anti-cult organization Cult Awareness Network, CAN. Founded in 1974, CAN was engaged in so-called deprogramming of individuals involved in new religious movements. The anti-cult movement led by CAN was based on pseudoscientific theories of brainwashing and mind control, developed by psychologist Robert J. Lifton and activist Edward Hunter. These theories portrayed members of new religious movements as helpless victims devoid of free will, which served as justification for forced deprogramming and other coercive tactics. Members of CAN used deception to manipulate the relatives of their victims into paying large sums of money for their deprogramming services. Beforehand, through public propaganda, they would manufacture the image of a dangerous cult, using it as a defamatory label against various religious organizations. One of the members of this organization was Rick Ross. As later determined by legal investigations, this criminal organization consisted of sadists, maniacs, and individuals with sociopathic tendencies, predisposition to antisocial behavior. They were responsible for brutal assaults, violent kidnappings, and so-called deprogramming of individuals. When the FBI began taking a serious interest in CAN's activities in 1991, Alexander Dvorkin urgently relocated to Munich, Germany, where his ideological ally and fellow anti-cultist, Pastor Thomas Gandau, resided. Gandau also specialized in deprogramming. Sometime later, Dvorkin moved to Moscow. In March 1992, Dvorkin secured a position in the newly established Department of Religious Education and Catechism under the Moscow Patriarchate, and began his campaign against the Bogorodishny Center. By 1993, he had already founded and taken charge of the St. Irenaeus of Lyons Information and Consultation Center, renamed in 2003 as the Center for Religious Studies in the name of Hieromartyr Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons. With embedding himself within the Orthodox Church, Dvorkin began imposing deprogramming methods and inciting religious hatred and intolerance by exploiting the fears and weaknesses of people who had no knowledge in matters of so-called cults. Moreover, in certain cases, his behavior was quite aberrated. Who is who? Alexander Dvorkin, a walking fake. July 24, 2006. Perhaps for this reason, as reported by émigré circles in the United States, the future sectologist collaborated in the early 1990s with a company involved in the adoption of children from Russia. But more importantly, it was during this period that his anti-cult activities truly began. Alexander Dvorkin became actively involved in promoting CAN, Cult Awareness Network, an organization founded in 1974 that specialized in so-called deprogramming of people involved in religious movements unfamiliar to society, acting at the request of their relatives. Later, on June 20, 1996, CAN was officially dissolved by the Chicago Federal Court due to bankruptcy. The reason was quite simple. Individuals subjected to deprogramming sued CAN and won massive compensation for emotional distress, which financially ruined the organization. Investigations into CAN's newly uncovered crimes continued even after its dissolution. For example, in 2000, a U.S. court found CAN and several of its agents guilty of specific kidnappings and assaults, which the court described as so outrageous in character and so extreme in degree as to go beyond all possible bounds of decency and to be regarded as atrocious and utterly intolerable in a civilized community. In this case, the victim was an independent Christian named Jason Scott. CAN classified his small religious group as a cult and decided to rescue Scott by first kidnapping him. The agent executing this operation was Rick Ross, whose criminal record includes, among other things, a conviction for the grand theft of $100,000 worth of jewelry from a store in Phoenix, Arizona. At that time, a prison psychiatrist diagnosed Ross with sociopathic tendencies, a predisposition to antisocial behavior. After Scott's abduction, Ross and his accomplices held him captive for 5 days, using various means to force him to renounce his wrong Christian faith. The Seattle court was so outraged by CAN's violent actions that it imposed nearly $5 million in fines on Ross and CAN. Through Germany to Russia. In 1991, when the FBI began to seriously investigate CAN's activities, Alexander Dvorkin urgently moved to Munich, Germany. However, instead of attending the Russian Cathedral of the New Martyrs under the jurisdiction of the ROC outside of Russia, he chose a small Serbian church for prayer and started considering returning to the USSR. Before the end of Mikhail Gorbachev's rule, Dvorkin visited Russia but primarily remained in Germany. This may have been influenced by his German ally and fellow anti-cultist, Pastor Thomas Gando, who also specialized in deprogramming. In fairness, it should be noted that Dvorkin adamantly denies any involvement with CAN. However, in the latest edition of his book on sectology, he speaks rather favorably about the deprogramming practiced by CAN, in some ways justifying it. But if there is programming, then deprogramming has also emerged, which often involved the forcible abduction of a cult member, if removing the victim from the cult environment by other means was unsuccessful, and confinement in an isolated place where specialists, psychologists, and former cult members would attempt to persuade them for many days or even weeks. Sometimes the abducted person's anger at those who took them only hardened their resolve, increasing their resistance and enabling them to escape. In general, the method of fighting fire with fire turned out to be completely inappropriate in this case, but it is unlikely that anyone with a heart and conscience would blame parents who, out of despair, resorted to deprogramming. A. L. Dvorkin, Sectology, Totalitarian Sects, Experience of Systematic Research. The fall of Alexander Dvorkin. According to recent reports from unofficial sources, the Russian Orthodox Church, ROC, finally realized the consequences of the destructive activities of former Radio Liberty employee, American émigré, and now out-of-favor anti-cultist Alexander Dvorkin, and decided to distance itself from this controversial figure. He has been sent indefinitely to Nizhny Novgorod to work alongside his associate, so-called deprogrammer Volkov, who also trained in this dark profession in the United States. As it has become known, the opposition to Dvorkin and his destructive activities for Russian society in general, and the ROC in particular, which has recently emerged within the ROC, has emerged as a new trend of sectologists in the missionary circles of the Moscow Patriarchate. It was headed by a professional anti-cultist, Father Oleg Stenyaev, a former religious dissident who joined the ROC from a foreign church, for which he received handsome dividends. It is also significant that during the Soviet era, Father Oleg Stenyaev worked for the anti-Semitic organization Pamyat, which was one of the reasons for his break with A. Dvorkin, a Jew by nationality, when the latter persuaded supporters of the religious organization Jews for Jesus to move not to the ROC, but to a Jewish synagogue. Realizing that Dvorkin had misled the church about the true nature of new religious movements and the real reasons behind mass departures from the ROC, Stenyaev openly condemns the methodology of the American Enlightener and the Protestant bacillus imported from the US. Father Oleg has finally realized that the mass conversion of people in Russia to non-Orthodox beliefs is directly linked to the failings of the post-Soviet Church's own priests, who have yet to part ways with the illusions and dogmas inherited from the communist era. Thus, Dvorkin's imported achievements of Western anti-cultists were erroneously used as the basis for the famous definition of the Archbishop's Council of the Russian Orthodox Church, November-December 1994, which diligently reproduced the accusations of sects and cults in the destruction of traditions and customs of the peoples of Russia. Although the first anti-sectarian conference of the Russian Orthodox Church, held in 1993, was directly financed by Protestants, and Dvorkin's first book on sects was published with the same funds. The Fall of Alexander Dvorkin, March 6, 2006. Perhaps Dvorkin's controversial past, including drug use and involvement with various minorities, played a role in his downfall, as suggested by his former colleagues. Now, having relocated to the Nizhny Novgorod diocese, all-Russian touring performer, Dvorkin has finally secured a stable, albeit modest, income from local sponsors. His departure curiously resembles Ivan the Terrible's maneuvering before implementing Oprichnina, period of terror during the reign of Tsar Ivan IV. Notably, Dvorkin's doctoral thesis, dedicated to the notorious Tsar, received harsh criticism from experts. One can only speculate about what new plans are brewing in the mind of this fighter against infidels. In anticipation of yet another reprisal against unfortunate sectarians, heretics, and other freethinkers, Dvorkin has already proposed establishing ROC-run rehabilitation centers for so-called victims of cults. According to a scandalous article from the early 1990s published in the Journal of the Moscow Patriarchate, these centers were going to forcibly detain individuals based on mere phone calls from Orthodox relatives or even neighbors who suspected someone of insufficient orthodoxy. Naturally, no legal justification for such gangster-style abductions would be required, only the blessing of a local priest. And yet, Dvorkin's idea was nonetheless implemented. Russia, as we know, is famous not only for its roads. According to the authorities' instructions, all psychiatric clinics in Moscow for a long time searched for these very imaginary, zombified victims of sectarians. However, in all likelihood, they came across such a large number of people who in fact suffered from the activities of the junior elders, false spiritual fathers from the Russian Orthodox Church, fundamentalists, and Dvorkin's anti-cultists, that the initiative was quietly shelved. For example, an unfortunate Krishnite videographer, examining the deep bite marks left by the zealous anti-cultist, still recalls with horror the frenzied attack and hysterical screams of the ROC's secret crusader, Alexander Dvorkin, who sank his teeth into the Krishnite's hands, drawing blood. The incident took place in the corridors of the Moscow City Court, when the videographer, unaware of the danger, ventured too close to this highly dangerous figure. Apparently, this modern-day oprichnik, the servant of God Alexander, could not tolerate such blatant trespassing on his canonical territory, and the unfortunate man shooting a documentary had to pay for that. Alas, no one has yet invented a muzzle for toothy theologians and rabid defenders of the faith. The bleeding videographer was surely rescued, likely with a rabies vaccine, while the zealous defender of orthodox purity was taken straight to jail. The poor Krishnite, once he had overcome his shock, shared his harrowing story on the website www.sectovid.narod.ru, created by Dvorkin's opposition. The site details the toxic fruits of the sectologist's activities across the vast expanse of our country. Sadism involves the sadist's morbid fixation on the need for violence against other people, cruelty in interactions with people or animals. Sadists crave emotional violence. They deliberately manipulate others through fear. The primary motive of sadists is the pursuit of power, control over others, and the satisfaction of their sadistic nature. A sadist is prone to aggression and cruel behavior. They derive pleasure from witnessing others, whether people or living creatures, experience pain, suffering, negative emotions, or helplessness. Sadists take pleasure in domineering or gaining control over others through violence, humiliation, and causing harm. Sadists often choose such professional activities, where it is possible to implement their latent sadistic tendencies and legalize moral or physical violence against other people. These professions may include executives, officials, inspectors, slaughterhouse workers, fur farm employees, prison staff, military personnel, police officers, and skillful internet trolls. By creating his international totalitarian sect within the anti-cult environment, Dvorkin found a unique niche to satisfy his sadistic urges and surrounded himself with like-minded individuals. A sadist infiltrates power. I realized that an expert isn't the one who knows something, but the one who is asked. Alexander Dvorkin's usurpation of power in Russia began through his infiltration into the executive branch. Contrary to the law, logic, and despite his lack of professional qualifications, Dvorkin became the chairman of the expert council under the Ministry of Justice. He was neither a civil servant nor a religious scholar, nor an expert in state-religion relations, as required by the regulations on the expert council. On the other hand, this was hardly surprising given that at the time, the Minister of Justice was Dvorkin's sect's adherent and former student, Alexander Konovalov, who studied under Dvorkin at PSTGU in the 2000s. So the question remains, who appointed whom? Still, it is intriguing. Who was truly behind Dvorkin's appointment, placing a mentally sick and socially dangerous individual in such a crucial government position? And for what purpose? This whole affair eerily resembles Stalin's appointment of the maniac, Nikolai Yezhov, as head of the NKVD, 1936 to 1938, a man who became one of the symbols of Stalin's Great Terror, mass repression, and brutal suppression of dissent. At that time, people's fates were decided by troikas, 3 officials, an NKVD representative, a party official, and a prosecutor, who indiscriminately sentenced individuals to execution or imprisonment without the right to defense, often in the absence of the accused. However, Yezhov's bloody career ended as swiftly and tragically as it began. He was soon dismissed, declared an enemy of the people, and executed by Stalin's personal order. In 2014, a new board of the Expert Council under the Ministry of Justice of the Russian Federation was approved, officially due to the expiration of the previous council's term. Before this event, a scandal erupted in the media over the council's unlawful activities, revealing behind-the-scenes truths to the public. One way or another, Alexander Dvorkin urgently reshuffled the council members and deliberately demoted himself to the position of deputy in the Expert Council on State Religious Evaluation under the Ministry of Justice of the Russian Federation. In reality, he simply stepped into the shadow leadership. Deputy positions generally remain out of the public eye. After all, people tend to say, "We blame whom we see," and it's always the boss's fault. The number of experts was significantly reduced, and the new board became more closed to the media, officially due to regular attempts to pressure its members. However, it is worth examining who was part of both the past and present State Expert Council under the Ministry of Justice of the Russian Federation. The connection is evident. The core remained the same, a group from RACIRS and their accomplices from Dvorkin's totalitarian sect, some of whom led RACIRS-affiliated organizations, while others were their colleagues and friends. For example, Alexander Dvorkin, president of RACIRS. Lev Semenov, RACIRS member, lecturer at the missiology department at PSTGU, head of the RACIRS-affiliated Spiritual and Educational Center of the St. Tikhon's Orthodox University of Humanities. Yevgeny Mukhtarov, RACIRS and FECRIS member, Dvorkin's biographer, journalist, head of RACIRS press service. Consultant to the Council on Religious Associations under the mayor of Yaroslavl, chairman of the Public Center Civil Security. Alexander Kuzmin, executive secretary of RACIRS, member of RACIRS and FECRIS, ROC cleric. Head of the RACIRS-affiliated Saratov branch of the Center for Religious Studies. Roman Silantiev, Dvorkin's colleague, employee of the Department for External Church Relations of the Moscow Patriarchate. Vladimir Belov, academic advisor to Alexander Kuzmin, head of the Center for Orthodox Culture and Religious Anthropology. Andrei Redkozubov, employee of the Moscow Patriarchate responsible for cooperation with the armed forces and law enforcement agencies under Father Dmitry Smirnov. Valery Smirnov, longtime friend of Dvorkin. Andrei Vasilchenko, member of the Council on Religious Associations under the mayor of Yaroslavl, general director of Gubernsky Narod LLC in Yaroslavl, researcher of the Third Reich, and colleague of Mukhtarov. The position of chairman of the expert council at the Ministry of Justice gave Dvorkin a huge opportunity to exercise his latent sadistic proclivity by influencing the lives of citizens on a national scale through the suppression of religious freedom. A sadist typically exhibits an unconscious impulse to oppose others by destroying their joy, betraying their expectations, and displaying a tendency toward neglect and humiliation. Dvorkin's deceitful rhetoric about the rampant spread of cultism in the country and the crimes allegedly committed by cults, including murder, physical and sexual violence, prostitution, fraud, and so on, was largely inconsistent with reality. In 2013, Russian investigative journalists uncovered a significant discrepancy between Dvorkin's claims of rampant sectarianism and the actual crime situation. Dvorkin apparatus, critical situation. September 23, 2013. So, Dvorkin began carrying out large-scale black propaganda and slander in the media, providing federal authorities with allegedly reliable information about sects and cults, and insulting believers' feelings in his so-called expert evaluations, but this time on behalf of the state. Instead of investigating actual crimes, the government started channeling money and resources into enabling Dvorkin's sadistic tendencies and his pursuit of dominance as compensation for his own feelings of inferiority. Through defamation, fabricating administrative and criminal cases against various religious groups, including Krishna devotees, Scientologists, Baptists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Muslims, Hindus, and others. Subsequently, Dvorkin established a well-functioning system of corruption within his totalitarian sect, apparently reinforced by opaque financial activities. He fabricated expert evaluations, testified in court on behalf of clients, and artificially initiated numerous investigations into religious organizations. By fabricating criminal charges against their leaders, he actively violated citizens' rights, influenced public opinion, and manipulated it with his lies. And this was happening while Dvorkin traveled across the country delivering his deceitful anti-cult lectures, including to government officials, law enforcers, specialists, and students at educational institutions. In fact, Dvorkin was preaching extremism, sowing national and religious hatred, promoting aggressive xenophobia, and contributing to media violence, thereby creating conditions for real crimes motivated by religious hatred. More details on this are presented in the Impact documentary, 2024. Alexander Dvorkin held a seminar on the prevention of religious extremism in the government of the Kurgan region, September 18, 2021. Renowned Russian sectologist, professor at PSTGU, and deputy chairman of the Expert Council on State Religious Evaluation under the Ministry of Justice of the Russian Federation, Alexander Dvorkin, conducted a seminar on the prevention of religious extremism for law enforcement and supervisory authorities in the Trans-Urals region. The conference hall of the Kurgan Regional Government hosted representatives from the regional offices of the Ministry of Justice, FSB, Ministry of Internal Affairs, Federal Penitentiary Service, Investigative Committee, National Guard, Regional Prosecutor's Office, District Administrations, and the regional government. Alexander Dvorkin provided an overview of the international situation related to the spread of destructive cults and sects, and discussed internal Russian issues. Dvorkin also used the missionary departments of the Russian Orthodox Church as a platform for expanding his shadow structure, an international totalitarian sect. In fact, he turned them into propaganda units of a Nazi-style power under the guise of the Russian Orthodox Church, which continue to exert massive influence on public opinion and citizen behavior. Today, this has evolved into a network of interconnected organizations and individuals that have become part of a large-scale system of parallel power, not only in Russia, but also in other countries, given that these organizations wield significant influence over state policy and public opinion. The photo shows Vice President of RACIRS, Archpriest Alexander Novopashin, head of the missionary department of the Novosibirsk Diocese, President of RACIRS, Alexander Dvorkin, Vice President of RACIRS, Archpriest Arseny Vilkov, head of the missionary department of the Ryazan Diocese, and the Secretary of RACIRS, Priest Alexander Kuzmin, head of the missionary department of the Saratov Diocese of the Russian Orthodox Church. One can only guess about the scale of mass psychological conditioning and brainwashing of public consciousness with extremist and terrorist ideology by Dvorkin's sectarians. As an example, let's look at the recent activities of just one RACIRS member, Priest Alexander Kuzmin. One of the core beliefs of a sadist, typically formed in childhood, is, "I must force others to obey me so they cannot make me suffer." Given that multiple requests have been submitted to the FSB, the Prosecutor General's Office, the Ministry of Justice, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to investigate Dvorkin's destructive activities, his fear of these agencies is obvious. It is no surprise that as he gained more power, he started bringing these structures under his unofficial control. As early as 2017, a parliamentary inquiry was filed to investigate Dvorkin's activities. State Duma Deputy Valery Rashkin has called for an investigation into the activities of sectologist Alexander Dvorkin. MP Valery Rashkin submitted a deputy inquiry to the FSB, the Prosecutor General's Office, the Ministry of Justice, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, requesting an investigation into Russian sectologist Alexander Dvorkin. According to Rashkin, the expert's activities could damage Russia's relations with India. The frequency of his campaigns against various religions, denominations, and nationalities within the Russian Federation, particularly against Indian citizens, suggests, in my opinion, that his goal is to spark an international scandal and drag Russia into new conflicts, wrote Communist Party member Valery Rashkin in his appeal, as cited by Life.ru. Previously, Indian citizen Prasun Prakash wrote on his Facebook page that he and his family in Moscow were being subjected to religious discrimination by cultologist Alexander Dvorkin. My father, Sri Prakash Ji, has been living in Russia for over 25 years. He practices Hinduism and is also the president of the autonomous non-profit organization Sri Prakash Dham Center for the Preservation and Development of Indian Culture. The organization helps people interested in Indian tradition and culture, as well as yoga as a science of life philosophy. Hinduism is the most ancient religion, and hundreds of millions of believers deeply respect it, Prakash wrote on Facebook. According to Prasun Prakash, he and his family have been harassed by Alexander Dvorkin, president of the Russian Association of Centers for the Study of Religions and Sects, and the Center for Religious Studies in the name of Hieromartyr Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, along with his associates. Prakash claims that Dvorkin systematically defiles Hinduism as a world religion and offends the feelings of hundreds of millions of believers worldwide. For some reason, Alexander Dvorkin cannot distinguish an ancient religion with a millennia-old history from a sect, or refuses to do so. When, against this backdrop, my family, myself, and those who deeply respect the pure connection between our countries are forced to face this. We feel heart-wrenching pain because Alexander Dvorkin tarnishes not only Hinduism, but also the honor of the Russian Orthodox Church, with which he cannot have even the slightest connection. After all, the Russian Orthodox Church has always been and will always remain a bearer of justice as a Christian value, said Prasan Prakash. Moreover, he described Dvorkin's actions as unconstitutional and damaging to the international reputation of the Russian Federation as a rule-of-law state. Following the attack on his home in December 2016, where he and his family reside, Prasan Prakash launched an online petition. I humbly appeal to the leaders of both nations, President of Russia Vladimir Putin and Prime Minister of India Shri Narendra Modi, as well as to the foreign ministers of both countries, Mr. Sergei Lavrov and Ms. Sushma Swaraj, and representatives of the Indian Embassy in Russia, to pay attention to this important issue and allow Hindus in Russia to live peacefully, assured of their safety from any kind of persecution by radical elements, such as Mr. Alexander Dvorkin and his accomplices. This situation naturally attracted the attention of India's largest news agencies, Press Trust of India and IANS. More than 20 Indian print newspapers also covered the story. Alexander Dvorkin is a member of the Expert Council on State Religious Evaluation under the Ministry of Justice and the primary driving force behind anti-cultism in Russia. Judging by his statements, he considers Islam a totalitarian sect as well. In one of his lectures, Dvorkin referred to the Prophet Muhammad as a pretty-faced shop assistant. Mockingly quoting the Prophet's words to his wife Aisha, Dvorkin joked, "The man knew how to give compliments, no doubt about that." According to him, the success of Islam's founder in spreading his message was due only to the fact that he began preaching that one could raid caravans, forcibly convert people to a new faith, and that all of this would be a well-deserved trophy. Expanding his sadistic activities through the executive branch, Dvorkin advanced his students and agents of influence into significant government positions, scaling up his anti-cult efforts. Through this method, he ensured a gradual infiltration into all three branches of power: legislative, executive, and judicial. Numerous instances serve as evidence of this pattern, where Dvorkin has placed various religious or public organizations on his Walter Künnet blacklist. Dvorkin has developed a specific scheme. The followers of his sect use the media to create a false, discrediting reputation of an organization as a dangerous sect, whom their guru Dvorkin targeted. Then, following his orders, the sect followers he has strategically embedded within the Ministry of Justice make official decisions, leading to the targeted organization being declared an undesirable organization in Russia. Then, his followers in the Prosecutor General's office fabricate cases, and Dvorkin's sectarians within the FSB employ unjustified forceful methods, actions that are essentially unconstitutional and anti-democratic, yet fully in line with the laws written by their great guru, Dvorkin. A striking example of Dvorkin's persecution is the case of Jehovah's Witnesses and Scientologists. These organizations, among many others, had been added to Dvorkin's blacklist, later labeled undesirable by the Ministry of Justice and expelled from Russia. Their members, living in Russia, endured the full ordeal of legal battles, repression, and persecution based on cases fabricated by Dvorkin and his sectarians within the Prosecutor General's office and the FSB. Moreover, members of these organizations experienced additional pressure in other countries as they were bombarded with up to 1,000 identical slanderous articles per week, all echoing the same anti-cult rhetoric. Regarding the corruption of the Dvorkin courts, there is nothing to say except one word: lawlessness. And if, in today's Russia, there still exists an honest judge who seeks to act in accordance with the Constitution, the law, and human rights, protecting innocent people from Dvorkin's tyranny, then a sinister phone call swiftly arrives from Dvorkin's sectarians within the presidential administration. At that moment, all Russian laws immediately lose their power in the judge's eyes. This, in turn, proves that Dvorkin and his totalitarian sect wield far more authority than the Russian Constitution itself. It all mirrors Nazi Germany during the height of Künnet's Apologetic Center, when the Weimar Constitution was significantly altered and stripped of value. The Nazis merely used the Constitution as a mere formality, while ruling through their arbitrary decrees and orders. Real power belonged to the Nazi leaders. Dvorkin, tirelessly and without hesitation, not only ideologically corrupted children and progressive youth in educational institutions by preaching Nazi ideas of superiority over others. He also organized international lectures and readings for experts, drawing into his sect similarly unhinged individuals with sadistic tendencies, people who, like him, are eager to ruin the lives of others. Dvorkin actively traveled across the country, seeking to recruit new members for his sect from among law enforcement agencies. He and his followers began systematically delivering regular lectures on totalitarian sects to employees of the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Russian Investigative Committee, and the Federal Security Service of Russia, FSB, in some cases making attendance mandatory. This not only helped Dvorkin expand his network of useful contacts and recruit new members into his sect and its affiliates, but also ensured that his totalitarian ideology influenced the executive, judicial, and legislative systems, transforming them into Dvorkin's own punitive and repressive apparatus. This paralyzed those who were supposed to protect citizens from people like Dvorkin. Furthermore, leveraging his official position, Dvorkin actively created legal precedents against various organizations, issuing expert opinions that served his interests and directly influenced court rulings, much like Stalin's signature approving death sentences. Changes in legislation. The position of chairman of the expert council under the Ministry of Justice gave Dvorkin direct influence over state policy regarding religious organizations. Through active sectarians of his totalitarian sect, such as Senator Yelena Mizulina, Dvorkin established a working group in the Russian State Duma to develop anti-cult legislation. This group later introduced significant amendments to Russian legal and regulatory frameworks, effectively restricting civil rights, religious freedom, and fundamental human rights. These actions drew criticism from the international community. On February 13, 2017, the Federation Council established a working group to combat destructive cults. It was led by Yelena Mizulina, deputy chair of the Federation Council Committee on Constitutional Legislation and State Building, and a Federation Council member representing Omsk Oblast. With Dvorkin's direct involvement, legislative initiatives were adopted and integrated into the country's legal system. Each of these amendments to the law gradually expanded the powers and influence of anti-cult structures affiliated with Dvorkin's totalitarian sect. Here are just a few of them. Federal Law No. 125-FZ of September 26, 1997, on freedom of conscience and religious associations. Federal Law No. 114-FZ of July 25, 2002, on countering extremist activities. Legislative acts of the Russian Federation on the establishment of additional measures to combat terrorism and ensure public security, 2016. Amendments to the Federal Law on Countering Terrorism, 2016. As a member of Dvorkin's totalitarian sect, Yelena Mizulina carries out other assignments from her guru as well. April 7, 2019, Mizulina fears sexually aroused inmates and demands a ban on yoga. Senator Yelena Mizulina is concerned about homosexual relations among detainees in pretrial detention centers. She sent a request to Yuri Chaika, asking him to investigate the legality of yoga classes being conducted in detention facilities. The issue stems from a letter the senator received shortly before from theologian Alexander Dvorkin. As the country's chief denunciator of sects, Dvorkin deemed yoga incompatible with traditional religions. According to him, yoga originates from a scandalously notorious pseudo-Hindu sect. Here is a direct quote from Dvorkin's letter to Mizulina. In the conditions of a pretrial detention center, such practices may lead to uncontrolled sexual arousal among practitioners and, as a result, to the emergence of homosexual relations among inmates in the housekeeping service unit. Dvorkin believes this would lead to prison riots, as inmates would refuse to take food from gay members of the housekeeping staff. He also argues that yoga does not align with the goals and objectives of the penitentiary system, claiming that practitioners contemptuously mock the fears of the outside world instead of undergoing resocialization. Ultimately, Dvorkin demands that these sacrilegious and destructive practices be banned. Senator Mizulina, in turn, attached a supporting request to the letter and forwarded it to the Prosecutor General's office. As a result, yoga sessions in Moscow's detention centers were suspended pending an investigation. The first yoga classes had started in 2018. Notably, the Federal Penitentiary Service, FSIN, considered the experiment a success. Inmates who participated in yoga almost never sought medical attention. The head of Butyrka prison, Sergei Telyatnikov, stated that the sessions helped both staff and inmates relax and release accumulated negativity. The influence of Dvorkin's totalitarian ideology on the elite. It is hardly surprising that even the country's highest leadership gradually fell under the influence of Dvorkin's totalitarian Nazi ideology, promoted through his own parallel system of power. On May 29, 2020, the President of Russia issued an executive order approving a new strategy for countering extremism in Russia until 2025, and Dvorkin had a hand in shaping it. Evidence of this transformation can be found in an analysis of the public rhetoric of the country's top leadership. Examining the period from 2003 to 2004 to 2012 reveals a significant shift, from advocating for citizens' constitutional rights to supporting restrictive measures against religious groups, in fact, against religious freedom. It is worth noting that the term totalitarian sects was introduced in Russia in the 1990s by none other than Guru Alexander Dvorkin. Here is an example of such a shift in stance, which has already affected the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. 2004. Address by Russian President Vladimir Putin to his trusted representatives, Moscow, Moscow State University, February 12, 2004. A particularly pressing issue is the administrative arbitrariness of the law enforcement system. The foundation remains for so-called extra-procedural actions, that is, measures taken by officials and agencies that are not provided for by law. However, citizens are not merely objects to be subjected to a punitive machine. The state, including its security agencies, should primarily serve the people, protecting their rights, interests, and property, not to mention ensuring their safety and very lives. 2012. Article: Putin calls for improving laws to control sects. October 25, 2012. The head of state believes that government bodies need to refine the legal framework to regulate the activities of totalitarian sects. When it comes to totalitarian activities, these pose a particular threat to society and individuals. It's not just a hunt for souls, it's a hunt for people's property, the head of state remarked during a meeting with Samara Region Governor Nikolai Merkushkin and local community representatives on Thursday, October 25th. I agree with you that state structures, both at the regional and federal levels, should consider improving the legal framework for this issue and ensuring these regulations are practically applied. Where did this rhetoric from the Russian president come from? The continuation of this article might shed some light on that question. As reported by Itar TASS, the topic of totalitarian sects was brought up by Elena Belchikova, a representative of the Samara Regional Institute for Professional Development and Retraining. Specifically, she appealed to the head of state to strengthen efforts against totalitarian sects and stressed the need for a database of such groups containing brief information about such sects, which would be accessible to regional education ministries and schools. Commenting on Belchikova's remarks, the president noted that during his regional visits, he frequently hears about problems with totalitarian sects. They're popping up like mushrooms, these little houses where strange rituals take place, where no one knows what's really going on, or they're driving people underground. It's a problem, and I agree with you, Putin said. So, some Yelena Belchikova approached the head of state with a request to improve countermeasures against the activities of totalitarian sects, with an entire Dvorkin package of proposals for strengthening Dvorkin's totalitarian power. But who is Yelena Belchikova beyond the titles listed? Even a cursory check reveals her name among many others in the lists of Dvorkin's supervisors. For example, in the Program of Activities for the 20th International Christmas Educational Readings, January 23 to 25, 2012. Program of Activities for the 20th International Christmas Educational Readings, January 23 to 25, 2012. The first Christmas readings were held in Moscow in 1993, the very year Dvorkin founded and took charge of the Information and Consultation Center, renamed the Center for Religious Studies in the name of Hieromartyr Irenaeus of Lyons in 2003, and launched his anti-cult activities. Starting in 1994, the Christmas readings drew over 1,000 attendees. Today, this forum gathers more than 5,000 participants, including clergy, government officials, and experts in education, sociology, and culture. Officially, this church public forum is chaired by Patriarch Kirill of Moscow and all Rus. But in practice, the true ruler of this event is Dvorkin, where, among other things, at his command, akin to that of a Byzantine Basileus, or more precisely a Basileus Basilion, king of kings, his sect's adepts subject all their undesirables and dissenters to a lynching tribunal. Among the forum's stated goals is expanding cooperation between church and state. In reality, it is the creation of a kind of union of throne and altar, the first step toward Dvorkin's ultimate goal, a world where politics must depend on religion, and religion must actively participate in and shape politics. Naturally, this aligns with Dvorkin's secret ambition, that Orthodox Christians can have only one czar. Guess who? Given the rapid growth of an army of influential adherents to Dvorkin's totalitarian sect across various regions, sprouting like mushrooms under the noble guise of forum participants, it is no surprise that during his regional trips, the president frequently hears about issues tied to the activities of totalitarian sects from so-called concerned public, who, in reality, are Dvorkin's sectarians, systematically engaging in psychological conditioning of the president, feeding him a distorted perception of reality. Clearly, all the names of these concerned individuals will, in one way or another, be linked to the activities of Dvorkin's sectarians or to Dvorkin himself. After all, he is not just a covert sadist, he is also a master manipulator who knows history well and draws useful lessons from it to secure his power, employing every possible means and method for psychological conditioning of society's elite. There is a well-known Russian idiom, Potemkin village. It originates from a legend about fake settlements allegedly built by Catherine the Great's favorite, Grigory Potemkin, along the Empress's route from St. Petersburg to Crimea in 1787 to impress her. The term Potemkin villages first appeared in 1787 in a letter by Austrian diplomat Charles Joseph Deline. Don't modern-day's presidential visits to various regions resemble that story, only refined by the cunning mind of the covert sadist Dvorkin? In pursuit of his own interests, he has set up these theatrical traps for the president, ensuring that wherever the president goes, he is met with the same Dvorkin's words about the so-called threat of totalitarian sects. Or is there something different at play? Clearly, to grasp what is happening and the full scale of today's tragedy, one must understand the nature of a covert sadist's needs. An aggressive person has a deep-seated urge to deceive, exploit, and use others for personal gain. Such individuals view all relationships and situations, whether concerning money, ideas, acquaintances, connections, or prestige, through the lens of, "What's in it for me?" Moreover, a neurotic like this is convinced that everyone acts this way, and therefore the only logical approach for them is to be better at it than others. For a sadist, mere obedience or complete submission from a chosen victim is not enough. The real thrill lies in the process of destruction, whether it's someone's independence, any hint of autonomy, or personal sovereignty. The covert sadist derives an extraordinary surge of energy and a sense of absolute power only from the suffering of a person who still clings to their freedom and self-determination, yet has already been defeated and subdued. After all, it is through this process that the sadist tests their total control and confirms their ability to manipulate another person's emotions and thoughts. The ultimate goal is to make the victim feel insignificant and powerless, a phenomenon that fuels not only the sadist, but also, on a broader scale, the roots of fascism. Sleeper cells. What can we expect from the covert sadist Dvorkin, who dreams of omnipotence, considering his activity in the stealthy takeover of power in the country through active influence over the legislative, judicial, and executive branches? A secret organization for a coup. Such a trend exists, given Dvorkin's extensive influence in various branches of power, as well as the mass psychological conditioning of the population through the media, the internet, and regional reserves of the missionary departments of the Russian Orthodox Church, ROC, zombifying people everywhere with Nazi ideas. In schools, prisons, colonies, youth and sports organizations, higher education institutions, and technical colleges, where the army of dependent students is trained. History shows that the main driving force behind political upheavals and revolutions is unemployed or underpaid youth, as well as ideologically disoriented students who have lost their societal anchor. Here is another example of the active work of one of Dvorkin's closest assistants and mouthpieces, Archpriest Alexander Dvorkin, Vice President of RACIRS, head of the missionary department of the Novosibirsk Diocese of the ROC. His Information and Consulting Center, ICC, website is simply overflowing with propaganda on anti-sectarian activity and prevention of extremist manifestations, counteracting extremist activities and terrorism, as if this were not the missionary department of the Orthodox Church, but the main directorate for organized crime, extremism, and terrorism. This is a telling demonstration that it's not just some Russian ICC, but from 2002 to March 2023. It was a corresponding member by decision of the Presidium of FECRIS, European Federation of Centers for the Study and Information on Sectarianism, with the international designation ICCS, Informational Consulting Center on Sectarianism. This clergyman regularly gives lectures to military personnel, law enforcement officers, the FSB, as well as students and school children, teaching them who is an enemy in the country and who is a friend. This strongly resembles the year 1937 in the USSR, when political instructors, special representatives of the political leadership of the state, actively delivered lectures to military personnel, political instructors in the Soviet armed forces responsible for the ideological conditioning of servicemen, typically serving as deputies of the commander for political education. Historical documents show that similar positions were established as early as the 16th century in the armed forces of other states, especially during revolutions, civil wars, or mass repressions. It seems that now this function of political instructors has been assumed by Dvorkin's sectarians, so-called clergymen. The harsh conditioning of minds with Nazi ideas of superiority, the recruitment of loyal followers into Dvorkin's totalitarian sect, has taken on massive proportions, extending from villages to metropolises, involving school children, students, public organizations, military personnel, and law enforcement agencies. All this is done under the banner of preserving and strengthening traditional Russian spiritual and moral values, while disguising it as seminars on destructive cults, religious extremism, and terrorism. During these seminars, they lecture about the involvement of various sects in coups, using historical examples like the Decembrists, Bolsheviks, Nazis, neo-pagans, etc., with an overview of destructive groups, recruitment methods, and psychological conditioning techniques. Doesn't this resemble covert training in extremist and terrorist ideologies? Can you imagine how far Dvorkin's madness has gone when his sectarian priests, those who initiate repressions against the masses, are simultaneously teaching children, youth, and adults extremism and terrorism right under the noses of law enforcement officers, the very people who should be protecting us from this lawlessness? What is their goal in manipulating the minds of children, infecting them with true Nazism? Are they preparing them to be future sectarians for the next Führer, Dvorkin? Or has Christian missionary work in the modern world turned into politics rather than promoting Christian values, love for God and mercy? Or is Dvorkin's official religion already dominating high politics, while the state is distracted by solving its geopolitical problems, and who actually created those problems? And what about the principle of the separation of church and state, enshrined in the Constitution of the Russian Federation, which implies that the church should not interfere in state governance, ensuring citizens' freedom in determining their relationship to religion and religious affiliation? News report on how the cultists from the Dvorkin totalitarian sect are taking over power in Russia. March 25, 2025. Seminar at SGUPS. A seminar was held for first-year students at the Siberian State University of Transport and Railway Transport, SGUPS, by the head of the missionary department of the diocese, Archpriest Alexander Dvorkin. The topic of the seminar is Sectarians and Revolution. Sects and Color Revolutions. Father Alexander provided a general overview of destructive organizations, recruitment methods, and the consequences of involvement with them. He discussed the participation of various cults in state coups throughout history, citing as examples the Decembrists, Bolsheviks, Nazis, Wahhabis, Neo-Pentecostals, and Neo-Pagans. Lecture by Archpriest Alexander Dvorkin for school children. 2703-2025. Lectures for educators. March 24, 2025. Seminar in Kochenyovo. A seminar by the head of the Diocesan Missionary Department, Archpriest Alexander Dvorkin, was held at the Kochenyovo Children's Creative Center, Mechta. Meeting with military personnel. Lecture for employees of the Department of Internal Affairs of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russia, Siberian Federal District. On the photo, RACIRS Vice President Archpriest Alexander Dvorkin at the meeting with employees and servicemen in the Krasnoyarsk Department of the Russian Federal Guard. March 28, 2025. Meeting with a representative of the National Anti-Terrorism Committee. On March 28, a business meeting took place at the Cathedral of St. Alexander Nevsky in Novosibirsk between Andrei Przezdomsky, an official representative of the National Anti-Terrorism Committee, and Archpriest Alexander Dvorkin, head of the missionary department of the Novosibirsk Diocese and rector of the cathedral. The last photograph is particularly striking. Just think about it. The official representative of the National Anti-Terrorism Committee arrives for a business meeting with Dvorkin's deputy in a church. Doesn't it look surrealistic? So, who controls whom? Another concerning aspect is the rhetoric of Dvorkin's mouthpiece. Lately, Dvorkin has increasingly voiced speculative suspicions that so-called extremist sleeper cells of sectarians are operating in Russian cities, supposedly ready to be instantly activated upon command from above. This could manifest, for example, as sect adherents taking to the streets to incite riots. At the same time, Dvorkin persistently directs his audience's attention westward, suggesting that it's them who are behind it all, the true organizers and instigators of chaos. Obviously, Dvorkin knows the get-the-thief manipulative technique used in propaganda, including for discrediting an opponent. This tactic is often used when those truly guilty of crimes against society, sensing their imminent exposure, are the first to raise an outcry, directing public anger elsewhere. The goal in such cases is to disorient the public and secretly manipulate their reactions. The real question is, why is one of Dvorkin's chief sectarians employing this strategy? And who is the intended recipient of this message? After all, psychologists know, to give a person a subliminal command, it is only necessary to push them with a key phrase, which in a special situation triggers an automatic response in the listener, one they are conditioned to follow without questioning. Through such veiled messaging, a manipulator can implant an idea into someone's mind without explicitly stating it, making them believe it was their own thought. This, in turn, prompts them to act as if of their own free will, and Dvorkin certainly has enough handlers to scale up such commands at precisely the right moment. It is essential to understand the psychology of the sadists within Dvorkin's totalitarian sect who have seized power. Once they have set the state's repressive machinery in motion, these maniacs will not stop on their own. History shows that if the repression machine is halted, the first to fall will be those who set it in motion, followed by a period of rehabilitating the victims of political persecution. Remember the fate of Yezhov and what Stalin did to him. Dvorkin knows history. He already wields power and exerts significant influence over the minds of the elite. This has allowed him to remain in the shadows, manipulate laws, dismantle constitutional rights, and carry out repressions. Fearing for their own survival, Dvorkin and the adherents of his totalitarian sect will continue fabricating new justifications for repression, tearing the country apart from within and driving it toward complete collapse. When the state runs out of so-called extremist and terrorist organizations to persecute, Dvorkin will invent sleeper cells, leading to people being imprisoned indiscriminately, simply because a neighbor got a feeling and reported their suspicions to Dvorkin's sectarians within the FSB. Or he will devise something else, further expanding the scale of repression and, consequently, his own power. Even if Dvorkin succeeds in orchestrating a coup, his insatiable appetite as a covert sadist will not be confined to a single country, especially since it possesses nuclear weapons. His followers are already fueling rhetoric about a large-scale religious conflict, a civilizational war between the Muslim and non-Muslim worlds. Think about the global bloodshed that would ensue if this deranged sadist's vision were realized. What catastrophic consequences would the civilized world face if this madman is not neutralized and stopped in time?